So, Kane, 20 of your finest minutes, if you can. Give us a talk about the opportunities and pitfalls of building and utilizing trust models.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot. Yeah, this talk was originally done with a co-speaker of mine. Like the full recording, I can shoot a link to. But I'd really love for it to be more collaborative. So all I'd ask is like if you have questions as you're going along, just hit the reactions button and just raise your hand, and I'll keep an eye on the Zoom. And yeah, like I say, I'd feel free to add this to be more collaborative, but I will, without you, share my screen. So like I say, I'll kind of be splitting this into two sections. There's the building bit, and then there's the breaking bit. So looking at, blue teaming and building things and securing things, and then breaking them after the fact. The breaking stuff was done by a co-speaker of mine, so it might fall apart a little bit there, but I think I remember his sections pretty well. I guess a little bit about me as well. Like I say, I'm currently at Canva now. I actually live in New Zealand, but born in Dawlish. Spent the first 27 years of my life kind of in the southwest, especially around Exeter for the most part. And so, yeah, I feel like I'm about as far southeast as you can possibly get, which I think is ironic for this group. But yeah, I'm coming over to B-Sides Exeter in July. Good excuse to come home, do a security talk, see the family, all that kind of thing. And yeah, like I say, we'll kind of speed through, I guess. But I always find that, I always like to start with this. I want you to imagine that we're in the year 2177. It's the future. And everyone's still giving these like, what is zero trust explanations. And I feel like a lot of people may have heard this already, but it's always good to have context, because I feel like people who do marketing have kind of bent the rules a little bit, and everyone has their own definition. But kind of, I say the old model, but it's, a lot of people still use this and it's still very applicable. But we had a VPN, we had a device, we used our username password, got access to the stuff. Kind of what happened is, SaaS came along, we started using the cloud, everything was in AWS and Azure, and all of these things weren't in our network anymore. And, there was a lot of problems with this. So, weak authentication was a thing. Like we were having username password breaches all the time because people kept reusing the same passwords, and you could access, your production stuff with your mobile phone and stuff like that. And so if your mobile phone was breached, the attacker would get in. And then once attackers got in the perimeter, they just kind of had access to everything. And, we did defense in depth. We did like segmentation, VLANs, all of that stuff. But realistically, once an attacker was in, it was usually pretty easy for people to move around. And so that's kind of what Zero Trust was designed to fix. And it doesn't really have a single definition. The definition I like to use is from like a Google white paper that they made a long time ago. And they kind of split it into three things, which is access to services must not be determined by the network from which you connect. Essentially, what that means is, your IP address shouldn't be a factor in what you can access. And number three, access to services must be authenticated, authorized, encrypted. All good security stuff that I hope we're doing. Anyway, regardless of zero trust. And two is like the interesting one. It's like the one that needs a little bit more explanation, because like this is where the meat of it is. So you have three things that kind of make up zero trust. You have a secured company-owned device. This usually has a piece of software on it, like a software agent or a certificate. You have a strongly verified user. So you have a user who is ideally using phishing-resistant MFA, so either passkeys or YubiKeys, this tends to be. And finally, you have what we call policy enforcement points, or PEPs as they're commonly known, which is you have to check these two things, the company-owned device and the verified user, before accessing a piece of software. So if I want to access Salesforce, I need to be doing it from a device which has my certificate on it, that identifies this as a corporate device, and I need to do it from a form of multi-factor that can't be phished, like SMS, email, something that's not ideal when it comes to security. And so I'll kind of show you a few examples of what this might look like in the real world. So this is what I would call a very simple SaaS example. I'll kind of take you through it from bottom to top. So you have a device inventory, has all your devices in. You like enroll those devices in your MDMs, so your mobile device management platforms. So Intune is a great example of this. And you connect it to public key infrastructure so that a certificate can be deployed via your MDM onto your device. And if you follow the green arrow there, basically what that means is that when I try and access an application, ideally through Okta or Azure AD or something, it does a posture check. It verifies that this is my device and this device is secured and whatnot. And then it kind of lets me through to all those services. Now, if I'm doing this from a BYO device, it won't let me access those things. It'll only allow me to access sort of things that we have allowed to be public. So this might be email or something like that. Maybe we have Salesforce as our very secure app, and we have like email as our public app, and we allow people to access that from their mobile device. And this is an example from my past. And this is a great example because on their website, they talk about it and stuff. And so the change from the simple example is that in the previous example, we had essentially what we would call two tiers. We have the sensitive stuff that we want to protect, and that's accessible in green. And we have the stuff that we don't really care about that much, and that's in purple. So when it comes to this one, we have three tiers. We have the really sensitive stuff. We have the stuff that, I'd like to protect it if I could. That might be email in this case. Email is pretty sensitive if it gets breached. And then we have what we call the open tier, which might just be something like Zoom or security training or something like that. Something that you would, like, if it was breached, you wouldn't care. And so it really depends on the granularity you want. And what happens is most people start with this and then they move on to this. But some never bother because they never need to. Now, some of the problems in doing this is zero trust is good, but it doesn't fix everything. And insecure networks are often described as Swiss cheese. And so I created some like AI generated, very cursed images to kind of give you an idea of how I think about security controls. So a control misconfiguration, they can be accidental or purposeful. And the idea is that, we have purposefully poked holes in the cheese in order for people to get stuff done. Maybe, we can't manage all our devices, so we had to have a couple of unmanaged ones. Or maybe we just set something up wrong. And so the holes can be accidental as well. And so these are a few things that I would consider misconfigurations. And I think just to dive into a couple of examples here, 2FA and device recovery is one that I see often abused. It's where, if I lose my multi-factor authentication, how do I get back in? Like, do I have to go into an office? If we're remote, how can I be verified remotely? And so how can you verify that people who are making requests to reset their 2FA are legit? If you're all in office, this is a much easier premise to fix. But if you're remote or you've got people in other places, it can get a lot harder. And user agent strings, I think, are an interesting one. Like, I may manage my macOS devices and my Windows devices perfectly. They might be in my asset inventory. I've got them in MDM, got all of that. But maybe I've got some Linux devices and they're not managed because that's difficult. And, there's only 5 users or something. Now, in order to give them access to my zero trust network, that I have to essentially poke a hole in it for them. and just say, hey, look, any Linux device can access our network. Ideally, you'd do it by user, but you do find people make these mistakes quite often. And so control avoidance is going around the cheese in our analogy here. So it's looking at, just tackling things that Zero Trust doesn't fix. And so again, here are a few examples. I don't think there are any particular callouts. We might get time to talk about a couple of them towards the end, but really what these all sort of incorporate is they're attacking things that aren't users. So like Zero Trust really focuses on protecting user authentications. It requires like a physical person. Whereas, you can target applications, you can target service accounts, bots, these kind of things, APIs. These often don't have a human interaction in them. And so they are more easily attacked because the controls we put in don't protect them. This is kind of where my analogy falls apart. And so I just have through the control and some disgusting melted Swiss cheese here where we're just kind of brute forcing our way in. And so really, I think the main sort of thing to talk about here is that if I can compromise a user's device, then I can still get into the network. Like Zero Trust does not protect against malware. And so that's often how people get into Zero Trust networks today. They, install a virus or something like that, and then an attacker gets control of their machine. And of course, the machine is trusted, so you can do whatever you want. A couple others here, insider threat, phishing user tokens, all of this kind of stuff. Again, it's kind of stuff that you can do, and you can still get access to at least some stuff. And so we'll talk hacking here. So we kind of talked around some of the more defensive stuff, and we'll talk around how you get, recon and initial access and that kind of thing. And when it comes to Zero Trust networks, phishing and social engineering are still king, basically. Like, even with all the controls we put in place, phishing and social engineering are still going to play a part. But instead of trying to get someone to give you their password, it might be convincing someone to run a program on their laptop, run some malicious software or something like that. And so most attacks abuse the human element. And even in a Zero Trust world, this won't stop. It certainly makes some things harder, don't get me wrong, but there will always be a way to trick people in. And so I don't want to dig too deep into the weeds on the various kinds of phishing, but kind of the summary of Zero Trust is that phishing user credentials, much harder. Getting code execution, malicious access on a device, that kind of stuff, much easier, or not easier, but the same. And so, these are ways that people often get in. And really, you can't really protect against this unless you're doing application allow listing and you're verifying every single application that comes in. It's often very onerous for small security teams. It's probably going to be the main way that you see sort of attacks happen. There are some other ways, though, and this is something my co-speaker made at the time. I'll just kind of summarize. Convincing people to give you session tokens is more powerful in a Zero Trust network than convincing people to give you passwords, because a session token will allow you to do some things in that service without having to go through MFA and the Zero Trust controls, because the idea is that you go through all these controls, you get the session token, and then you're good for a little while, however long you set your sessions. Maybe they're an hour, maybe they're 5 minutes. Generally, you'll see people with sessions at about a day. And so if you can get a session token, yes, you won't be able to use it for very long, but it's still going to give you access for an hour, which is a very long time for an attacker to be in your network. And so that is definitely something that you will see in the Okta breach last year. Definitely used seized phishing tokens. Seized session tokens. And so it is something that attackers are starting to move to in the wild. So we can, of course, just ask the user for access, as I was kind of talking about. We can convince them to give us a session token. We can even do things that get us the session token, but seem less suspicious. So if anyone has ever done debugging in Chrome, you might know har files exist. These will often store sensitive sessions in. So maybe you pretend to be the IT team and you say, hey, we've noticed some problems with your laptop. Can you just run this debug thing in Chrome and send me the file? And when that file is in, there's probably a load of interesting cookies and session tokens and loads of interesting info in there for you. All of that, again, will bypass zero trust things. And so kind of, even though we talk about like user credentials and stuff, I do want to like reiterate that like just putting MFA on is not a silver bullet because of session token theft and all of these other things. And so, you can implement very, very strong MFA. You can implement strong sessions that time out, but your users probably won't enjoy it. And so it's always like keeping that balance, And the more infrastructure you have, the more problems you have. And so, if you are an entirely Windows-based company, you only need one MDM. If you have Macs, maybe you need two mobiles, or maybe you can get them into those two, or maybe you need a third. It starts getting way more complicated to maintain and build zero trust infrastructure with the more platforms. And so I always recommend to people, if you've got 3 people running MacBooks and the rest of the company is on Windows, just try and like maybe virtualize them. Maybe give them Macs in AWS, like in the cloud, and just have them use a Windows device. Because at the end of the day, as a small security team, you probably can't protect everything. And so it's going to help you simplify your network, and you'll be able to build this much easier. Just mindful of time, I'll kind of skim through a little bit. I'll kind of take you through what an attack might look like, and then I've got a quick summary. So this is kind of my simple zero trust example from earlier. And this is how an attacker might try and breach that network. So in theory, an attacker cannot have the device and it cannot have the strong MFA and all of that from the user. So in theory, that they can't do anything. But in practice, there are always ways around this stuff. And so, it really depends on how you set this up. And I think this example here should kind of provide you that example. So before we said we had 2 tiers, right? And so we may have like a BYO device. We might have compromised like a user's mobile or a user's laptop, but it'd be their personal laptop, not their work laptop. And so how do we get to the interesting stuff? Well, first we try and enroll that machine in the MDM. We try and turn their personal device into a work device. Most MDMs are open for anyone to just enroll things into. And so we do that and we kind of get access to some stuff, perhaps. Maybe we don't get everything. And so we can't access the high tier stuff, like the really sensitive stuff, because we're not an official managed device and all of that. We haven't got the certificate. We're not in the right groups. But we can potentially get around that to get to some of the good stuff. And so what we can do is we can abuse some misconfigurations in how it was set up. So like I say here, we have our IDP that they'll access the apps in, and we've got 2 sensitive apps that we want to access as an attacker. Now we try and do it. We can't get in. Oh no. But what we do is we try and connect to it, and then we can see what happens in the connection. So from that info, we might be able to get a URL to that address, and we can find, oh, look, they've set up SAML incorrectly, and I can actually just use username and password because I don't know, the app didn't support SAML in the first place or something like that. You'd have to be really lucky to pull that off, I think. But realistically, the second example is more realistic and more what I see in real life, which is app number 2 does enforce SAML. It's all set up correctly. It's all good. But it has an API. And that way I can just try and get an API token. API tokens often don't go through the IDP at all. They just go straight to the app. And so if it does allow basic auth, there we go, we're in. And additionally, this is a hypothetical example, but often the people management systems, the HR systems that deal with payroll and leave and all that stuff, they're often not in the most sensitive bucket because people need to be able to access it from their personal devices when they're sick and stuff like that. And so if you can get access to the people management system, you may be able to change things because they will often sync with Active Directory. They're often the source of truth sitting at the top. So if you can change things in the people management system, it flows down. And so that can also give you access that way. And so what went wrong in this example? Well, like, I think the second two are probably the most interesting here. So like sensitive applications could be bypassed because they weren't set up correctly, or they weren't just gated. Like with that API, it's hard to protect APIs. Often the only way to do it is with IP allow lists, VPNs, this kind of stuff. And so, it's a tough ask to be able to protect all of that stuff. So a little bit over, I think, but I'll kind of wrap up if that's okay. I'll say that like these attacks aren't theoretical, they are happening today. And so you do get some pretty skilled attackers out there. These are 3 examples that have kind of utilized things that I talked about in this talk. So Okta, really interesting breach. Would recommend reading the report. Certainly one of the more complicated attacks I've seen in recent years, but I kind of talked about those HAR files. They managed to get one of those, managed to get the session tokens out of it. They managed to connect to APIs of a customer. And from there, they managed to get access to multiple of Okta's customers' data. So really interesting. LastPass had a couple of incidents involving malware. I mean, who doesn't realistically? But they had one where they pivoted from a personal machine where they had a Plex server into a work account. And so, again, another really interesting breach. An example I used from Shopify was just insider threat. Really simple. They just had insiders sell information to competitors. And like I've kind of dunked on zero trust a bit, but I will say that it is a good thing. Like it does protect against credential stuffing and basic phishing, which is the cause of about 70% of attacks today, of like actual breaches. And so, you get really good bang for your buck when you implement this, but attackers will adapt to the landscape. Like as we get better with our controls, so too will they. And so it's kind of the old, you don't have to be faster than the bear, you just have to be faster than the other people running away from it. Similar deal, I think. And when you're building zero trust, these are just some future thoughts. Like it's getting easier. Like security keys cost money to buy. They are physical things. Pass keys are almost as good as security keys and totally free. Like they just work on your mobile. If you haven't looked at pass keys and you're using Okta or Azure AD, would strongly, strongly, strongly recommend it. And your off-the-shelf zero trust tooling is getting better. You don't need to build this stuff yourself. If you are running Intune, a bunch of Windows devices, you're running Azure context-aware access, you can set it up in like an hour. It is so easy, so easy. It gets more complicated when you have more apps and more operating systems and all of this stuff. But for smaller companies, it actually can be easier than the legacy ones. As I kind of talked about, like zero trust is not infallible. You got to combine it with application control, browsers, incident response. You can't just rely on prevention. You've got to do detection and response and all of that stuff as well. These are some of my predictions of what we'll see. Like I think malware is hard to build, but it's solid. It always works no matter the network. we already see a bunch, but I think we'll probably see a lot more. And session token theft, I think, is something to just be on the eye out for. Like, again, it's causing a lot of real world breaches today. So if you don't have detections in place and you're not thinking about reducing your session lengths and things like that, something you can consider. Like I said, the majority of attacks compromise weak user accounts. So if you can, you don't need to do zero trust. If you can just release passkeys, you protect against all of that for the most part anyway. So just use strong MFA pretty much. And that's me. Thank you very much.